conversation wider. And so I feel in the moment, and I think it's fair to say in the spirit. So I've been writing notes here as folks have been talking because this conversation feels both urgent and important to me, but also because the stuff that's being said just opens up the lock here. And I appreciate you opening up the economic context of the South here and going back to NAFTA. And as somebody who worked on those issues, and including the WTO and other things to sort of create the economic context within which we now find ourselves, I particularly appreciate that. You know, we just did a study in New York with the New York Academy of Medicine, and we spent about 4 years, which was a lot longer than we anticipated, working on this report about a public health approach to drug policy. And we went around the state of New York and asked 500 people in nearly 25 consultations, community members, lawyers, people living homeless, people on drugs, people off drugs, the whole mix. We asked them about drug policy and what they thought about it, and after that period of consultations that lasted for about 18 months, the thing that the findings that emerged, I should say, were, we were asking about drug policy. The findings that emerged in Long Island, which where the consultation was with predominantly middle-class white folks, and in the heart of Buffalo, which is a Rust Belt city, and in Brooklyn, and in Bed-Stuy, and in Newburgh, everywhere we went, it didn't matter if the group was majority folks of color or majority white. The two most consistent findings that we had when we asked people about drug policy is in what do you think about it, what's going on for you, how do you feel about how things are going on right now, place and race. Those were the two emergent findings, place and race. Where you live and race were the two most consistent findings. Now, I was happy about that because those are important things to me, but this is what we found in our research, and it'll be in our report. And so for anybody who's asking what does the economic context, what does the, even going back 500 years to Christopher Columbus getting lost, what does any of that mean to drug policy? To me, it means everything, and now we have some research to demonstrate that it means a whole lot. I disagree with Daryl that you can do drug policy work, criminal justice work, and not do racial justice reform. I disagree with it because those systems have been so clearly designed for racial social control that if we say that what we're doing is working to reform any of those systems, then we have to understand how those systems came to be. And if we don't understand that, then we're confused. And there's a saying by a guy named Ron Chisholm, who's out of New Orleans, who has a saying that basically if you don't understand racism, everything you think you do understand, you're just confused about it. I think I'm somewhat paraphrasing him there, but that's the general gist. If we're doing this work and don't understand how these things came about, then we're not really doing what we think we're doing. And that's true of white people and people of color. I will say specifically with respect to white folks, we oftentimes have this conversation about race, if we have it at all as white people. We usually have it in the context of talking about how bad it is for black folks and Latino folks and people of color in the world, and that's true. And when we talk about it, to call this a field, to use that term, in the criminal justice or drug policy field, or in the reform world, or if I dare call it a movement, when we talk about it this way, we tend to talk about it as using statistics and terminology and talking about how bad it is for black folks and folks of color, and those things are true. But we don't talk about what this stuff is doing to us as white people. And so just to hit on that for a few moments, what does it mean to have a drug war and a system of mass incarceration where we see the kind of statistics that have been laid out and that can be well documented? What does that mean for white people? It doesn't mean that only that our neighbors and our friends and our brothers and sisters are being harmed and damaged. It means something fundamental about how it is that we conceive of ourselves. Because when we're not talking about race, right, when white people are not talking about it, we have the luxury of not thinking about it. Now those of us, we may think about it all the time, but we don't have to, because we live in a world, or at least in a society certainly, that doesn't compel us in any way, shape, or form as white people to think about that. Now, what that means is that everything in the fabric of our lives, including our families, is deeply implicated in this in ways that we're not being honest with ourselves about or even aware of. The marriages that we have and celebrate with each other, the birth of our children, the ceremonies that we celebrate in terms of the graduation from school, the advancements that we make in our professional lives, the sports games that we share and celebrate with our friends, especially if we're from Baltimore, potentially, like the Giants didn't make it in there. All of those parts of our fabric lives that are perhaps not part of the sort of active work that we do are all implicated in this in a very deep way. Because it all comes at the expense of a deeper awareness of our humanity that is deeply implicated in the fact that if Anthony is in a plantation in the year 2000 on a cotton field, having to strip down bare naked just to not die of heat stroke, that has something that is immediately connected to my daily life and my conception of myself. And it is that way because everything about what it is that I do in terms of the context that I operate in is the result of white supremacy. It is the context is white supremacy. It means I can't breathe without operating in that context. There's no way for me to do it. And as white people, there's simply no way for us to operate outside of that context. We're all implicated in it. Now, we're deathly afraid of talking with each other about that. That's just true of white people. We're afraid of it, deeply afraid of it. We love talking about how damaging it is for black folks. We love talking about how harmful it is for Latino folks and so forth. And those things are true. We're deathly afraid of talking about what this means for ourselves. So afraid that we don't, not only do we not do it, but we create a process where we never have to do it. Now, I would posit that the drug war has not just had a serious damage on folks of color, but we also don't tend to talk about this. I'll use this, I don't want to say much about statistics, but I'll use one here. You know, in Connecticut a few years ago, a colleague of ours, Lorenzo Jones, who's out of the Better Way Foundation, they were putting together a campaign for criminal justice reform, which they won. And one of the arguments that they used is they were saying, look, roughly 82 or 83% of the folks who are imprisoned in the state of Connecticut are black and Latino. But roughly 81 or 82% of the folks that are dying of drug overdose are white folks living in the rural areas. Now that really resonated with me because, and on a personal note, I should say that as white folks, we're also never compelled to tell our personal stories in these circumstances. We tend, the advocacy world is rife with a problem where it's essentially designed to allow for us as white people to tell the statistics and tell the stories, and then we got to bring in somebody like Anthony to tell his really terrible personal story, but we're not going to allow Anthony to set the tone or agenda in terms of a strategy on how we want to move forward. So it's good if I can set up a legislative hearing and somebody like Anthony can come and talk about how terrible everything is, and then he can do that in the context of my campaign. That tends to be how we operate, just speaking fair.
Go ahead.
But with white folks, we, just speaking on a personal note, that statistic that Lorenzo said resonated with me because, you know, I grew up in a rural place in California. So what that means in Northern California, you know, for white working class and poor people, is that, you know, methamphetamine was a significant part of our lives. Not every white person does methamphetamine, but we certainly did. My family has a long history of addiction and drug use. I was fantastic at using methamphetamine for a good period of time. And I could rob you blind in order to pay for it. And I was good at that too. You know, I got family members that have done jail time. But you know, I didn't grow up in a context where anybody told me I was going to college. And you know, I grew up in a context where I was told, you know, because I could get in trouble, well, you know, if you don't end up dead or in jail, you're going to be lucky. Now, when I reflect on that and have a deeper understanding of what was going on there, you know, I can understand that the reason that, perhaps say, for instance, my mother has never gotten into a kind of program that might be valuable to her is in part because none are available. And that's in part because we spend all of our money in California building prisons to lock up folks of color. Right? And in part because of the stigma associated with poverty and drug use and addiction and so forth. And the place there mattered very much, and those economic conditions mattered a great deal because they led to a series of decisions that people made as individuals and a family. There's very much implicated in the drug war. We don't tend to talk about that as well very often. We really should. The couple of things I wanted to note here for working in the South, just based on my experience, which are equally, if not more so, applicable in the North, is that as white folks, we have to be careful, particularly here in the South, but everywhere, to not lose the centrality of race as a lived experience and a political reality that shapes every asset or aspect of life here and elsewhere. Like in the North, we like to believe that we are a lot smarter and a lot savvier and so forth. But in fact, the most sophisticated politics in this country are practiced here in the South, particularly by the black community. The mere survival of the black community with this level of, like the fact that we could be here today in a place like North Carolina with somebody like Daryl Atkinson or Marissa, that's her name, I'm sorry, that's her name, or Anthony or Ms. Brown, is a testament to that fact. In a place where, we still have not even, we can't even say the word chattel slavery in polite company in mainstream America today, but here we are in the belly of where that situation occurred. We have to be careful because there's a great and constant push to undercut any effort to build movement. And some years ago, an example I would give is that when I was still, wet behind the ears, so to speak, at DPA, and I was down working in Alabama, still wearing a suit that didn't fit, and doing things that were above both my pay grade and understanding. It was right when Pastor Glasgow and I met, not too long after that we met in Dothan, when not too long after he got out and set up a training in a halfway house with 5 people that came. We drove up or down on a rainy night to do that training almost 10 years ago. It was a little bit after that, and I was down there in Alabama. We were working on a sentencing reform bill, and I was working with Pastor Glasgow and another guy, Reverend Kobe Little, and a local donor, of which there are quite a few in the South, which is another thing we're not going to probably get at today, but there's a reason why the infrastructure of the South for social justice is anemic, because it was deliberately undercut and destroyed as a result of the Civil Rights Revolution. It didn't just happen. But we also don't like to talk about that in funding context and all that sort of thing. But that aside, a local funder often, and I'm also not supposed to say this out loud when you're an advocacy organization, but this is true. A local funder basically offered to give DPA $50,000. Now, this was an interesting moment because I certainly had there was no reason it wasn't going to need $50,000 to do anything. I just weaseled into my job in the first place. And number 2, DPA didn't even operate down here in the South. We were from New York. Now, Pastor Glasgow down there in Dothan and Reverend Little, who was living over there in Selma, were the local folks leading the effort. But this local group refused to give them any of the money. And there was this interesting moment where I had fortunately been trained, as Daryl noted, because that's important enough, and had enough sense enough to understand this is a real significant problem. Now, I refused the money. I did not tell my boss immediately about that conversation until much later. But that was something that was an insightful experience for me, because it highlighted the fact that if some white kid from New York here with no face and he offered $50,000, that dog, right? Like they could have put a bone right in my mouth. And I was fortunate to be surrounded by folks like Pastor Glasgow and others who could help me as a black community more humanity to understand that moment. And I'll say one more thing and then I'll shut up. And it's on that point about white folks. We desperately need to build authentic relationships with folks of color. We need it for our humanity. If we don't do it, we lose something in a way that is far more significant than losing a campaign or losing a piece of legislation, losing a grant.
we lose a sense of ourselves that we need to understand collectively how we get out of this mess. We won't get out of it unless we do. And it's of utmost importance that we do this. And white supremacy is so powerful that I did not understand until I was in my early 20s that my father was and is an Arab American person. I grew up as white, my family identifies as white, but all of us as white people, there's no white land on this planet. None of us are white as white people. It's a fiction, right? This is why we need to build authentic relationships with each other, folks of color, is because white is a collective fiction. And we are participating in its maintenance every day. And if we don't do something conscious and deliberate to address that fact, we're doomed. Now, right? I mean, it took me until, think about that, it took me until I was early 20s, and that was when I even developed after political consciousness. Even after I developed political consciousness, it was not immediate. It took me until I was early 20s to understand that my father was Arab American. And my father still identifies as white. Right? None of us as white people, there's no white land that we emerged from. All of us have a history and a culture that goes back a long way. We can learn something from the black community and black history, from the Latino and Chicano struggles, Native American Asian struggles, because that's one of the ways that they have survived this mess that we're in, by maintaining a connection with that history and that cultural framework that has allowed them to have a sense of their humanity that we as white people have given up in order to have a bone in our mouth. And for poor white folks in particular, right, the reason so often that we make decisions against our economic interests is because we need a sense of our humanity. And that's about maintenance of white supremacy. It's not about anything else. It is ultimately about that maintenance of white supremacy. A person who doesn't know who they are is like a drowning person. You need to have compassion for them, but they're dangerous and they'll kill you if you get too close. And that's what we are as white people. We do not have a sense of our own humanity. We're dangerous. We will kill ourselves and folks of color. We're like drowning people. That's why somebody needs to bop us on the head, knock us out, pull us by our hair to the shore so we can get a breath and come out of that mess. But that's why poor white folks vote against their self-interest. It's because we have no sense of ourselves as white people. And we are desperate to hold on to it. We need it. Everybody needs a sense of themselves. So I think this work is fundamentally about that process. If it's not, then it's not about nothing. And as we saw, as Daryl noted with the convict leasing system, you can end slavery, but then they just make it something else. I'm not interested in passing a piece of legislation that gets the sentencing laws changed if it means it doesn't get me closer to understanding who it is that I am and helping me realize the full potential of my humanity and that of those around me. Now we can do that through housing, economic justice, all this sort of stuff. But right here, we're working on drug policy and criminal justice. So we got a big task to do, and we can't separate these things out. And these conversations need to be at the center of this work, not on the periphery of it. And we need to be careful, as white people, to not make decisions that either turn folks of color into a prop on our stage of nonsense, or to undercut people of color in leadership by taking a bone and putting it in our mouth so that we are muzzled and can't speak to them or even ourselves, or in the dark night when we're all alone. We want to be able to have a sense of ourselves and not wake up in the morning and feel like we've made decisions that further something that simply make us meaningless to ourselves and